Բաքսի ուրեմն իդեալ։ Փոխարինեք ձեր 5-ացան Բաքսի Eco 4S գեր ժամանակակից կաթսայով։ Մանրամասները easier-system.am
Nottingham University professor Fernando Casalbertoa will sit down with the First Analytical tonight. Mr. Casalbertoa, thank you for this opportunity.
My pleasure.
So you teach comparative politics at Nottingham University, and you have stated that Armenia is a weak democracy. Why? What makes it so?
Well, I would like to say that the situation in Armenia is much better than it was, before 2018. So at least now it's a democracy. But it's a weak democracy in the sense that, there are still a lot of things to improve. There are clearly free and fair elections, something that you didn't have in the past. But there are still a lot of problems with, for example, the independency of the judiciary, high levels of corruption, even if this has clearly improved, the quality of governance, rule of law, respect for minority rights, and many other issues that are important for a democracy to be consolidated and be of good quality.
One of the main accusations that the opposition throws at Prime Minister Pashinyan is that he is a populist. You are the person to go to for clarification. Is the Prime Minister of Armenia a populist or not?
Well, that will depend how you understand a populist is, because there are different understandings of populism. You have a socioeconomic understanding, for example, a government that overdoes it in spending public funds without any responsibility in Latin America has been considered to be a populist. You have also the concept that populists are those that have a certain political style. For example, that they have bad manners in the way they portray their ideas. They always are looking for a threat against the representation of the pure people against the corrupt elites. You have also the idea that populism is a kind of political strategy, right? When you want to have this kind of direct relationship with the people. The Mexican former president, AMLO, is a clear example. But perhaps the most let's say acceptable definition of populism is that opposes people, the pure people, to the corrupt elites, and looks or defines politics as the representation of the general will. And in that understanding, I do not think that Pashinyan is a populist. So it may well be in political style, it may well be in as a political strategy, even in political discourse perhaps, but as the general understanding of populism as a thin ideology, I don't think Pashinyan is a populist.
I think you have just put an end to popular debate in politics in Armenia. Okay, non-constructive opposition is part of a weaker democracy. Two antagonist blocs with no or little dialogue that leads to little or no policy at all. So the picture we have in Parliament today is that the Parliament has been elected democratically, but that's almost exactly what makes it inefficient at the same time. I would like your comment on this.
Well, and this is because of the high levels of political polarization in the country, which, interestingly enough, take place at the lead level, given that, the normal Armenian citizenry is not that much polarized in this sense, I would say. And I think, this is a problem because, on the one hand, there is a lack of mutual acceptance in the sense that, for example, the opposition just decides to criticize in a non-constructive manner, in a non-constructive way, and the government sometimes lacks what is called institutional forbearance. So the fact of abusing at times, the power that they have to the limits that sometimes might be, still, officially legal, but they are not, let's say, democratically accepted.
You've been part of drafting Armenia's electoral legislation, so you are closely familiar with it. Do you see any legislative holes or traps for democracy? What needs the government do to make democracy irreversible if we speak about this from the perspective of legislation?
Well, to be fair, there has been a lot of important improvements in terms of legislation in this country. You mentioned electoral legislation, but also in terms of financing of political parties, even in terms, guaranteeing the independence of the judiciary. I think the main problem that I see it is, well, I would say I see two problems. One is poor implementation. I think that this is a clear problem of the legislation. The legislation may be good, but it is poorly implemented. And the other one is a bit connected with my answer to your previous question, is the fact that sometimes there is a certain, let's say, partial use of what is a good legislation, right? So I think that these two things are very important and need to be improved.
Government alternation is another very important component of democracy. Paradoxically, democratic transition of power may end in the coming to power of non-democratic regimes. In our case, for example, the Republican Party, that would not mind for the old regime to be back. What's your comment on this democratic paradox? And is there something that the government can do to make democracy irreversible?
Well, certainly, you are right that we cannot talk about, for example, a consolidated democracy until there is at least, one alternation in government. And in a way, what the famous scholar Lindsay Stepan called, democracy becomes the only game in town. No? So there is this acceptance that the only way to oust someone from government and to become part of the government is through free and fair elections. I think that in terms of the government, the important thing that they need is to really give example, right? To show that by behaving democratically, by respecting the laws, by proper implementation, is the best way to improve also not just the functioning of democracy, but also the quality of life of Armenian citizens. I think this is very, very important.
We have a socially very polarized society, a very small middle class. On the other hand, we know that democracy is sustained by the middle class. Can democracy, in its turn, do something to create a larger middle class? Because these two balance and provide for each other.
Yes, indeed. There are these theories about, the economic theories or economic development is what leads to democracy. But there are also the theories that said that when you achieve a certain level of economic development, democracy will not collapse. That's why it's so important. But democracy itself, the freedom, not democracy, but the freedom that democracy provides is what allows, for, private, activities, freedom of thinking, initiatives that are impossible, when the government tells you what you need to do. So in this way, as you are saying, they fit into each other. So I think, by maintaining freedom, providing for laws that are, have a liberal character and allow for private initiative, this will improve, economic development. It has been proven that, democracy is one of the best systems to economic growth. So I think that by keeping democracy itself, the government or the political parties in general are already providing for potential, economic development.
According to some experts, a minimal level of corruption is necessary to, so to speak, grease the state machine and to make it work properly. Is this not, in reality, the indicator of a poorly functioning machine? Or do you share this opinion? If you do, what's the correct proportion of corruption in state systems?
Well, if I had the answer to this question, I would be a millionaire by now. I mean, what I can say is that corruption is a bad thing for democracy. This does not mean that corruption can be eradicated absolutely. I think that this is a panacea that a lot of people have in their minds. Sometimes I think that with democracy it's also important, especially new democracies, it's also important to manage expectations, because when the country democratizes, people have a lot of hope, a lot of expectations, and then they see that things are not the way they are. Perhaps because they have too high expectations. I think that, for example, in Armenia there have been important improvements in terms of decreasing the level of corruption. But for example, the non-renewal of the head of the corruption prevention committee, because he was investigating some of the parties and even the family of the politicians, well, clearly shows to what extent the government is really wanting to fight into corruption, or for example the fact that the Pashinyan party has been accused of illegal funding. These are things that are important to take into consideration when trying to combat corruption. As I said, it is impossible to eradicate corruption absolutely. But I think you have to get a minimum level. What that minimum level is? Well, clearly not corruption at the state level. I think this is essential.
You have enumerated the symptoms of a weak democracy. What is the pill to make it stronger in the case of Armenia?
Well, it goes back a bit to what we were talking at the beginning of our interview. I think that this has been posed by two very prominent scholars, Levitsky and Ziblatt, in their famous book How Democracies Die. For a democracy to really be consolidated, on top of all the indicators that we have just mentioned and government alternation, I think it is essential these two components that we were talking, mutual acceptance, to know that at the end of the day, one day you're going to be in opposition, and what you don't want is that the new government treats you as you treat them before, and the fact that when you are in opposition, you have the opportunity to, in 4 years, come back to power. So in this sense, it is also important to have this institutional forbearance that we were talking at the beginning of our interview. It's not only about making good laws. It's also about implementing it in a proper way. Even if it is legal, abusing power, it's not something that you should do.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Nottingham University professor of comparative politics Fernando Casalberto sat down with the first Analytical tonight.